David Turner had always prided himself on being a man of consistency. At 41, he'd carved out a comfortable life in a small but affluent suburban town, working as an accountant for a mid-sized firm downtown. His days were structured and orderly, much like the ledgers he meticulously maintained at work. He thought of himself as a good husband to his wife, Claire, and a devoted father to their 10-year-old son, Ryan. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, something David cherished deeply. But the signs had started to creep in. Subtle, almost imperceptible changes in Claire's behavior began weaving cracks into the life David thought was solid as bedrock. At first, he dismissed them. He convinced himself that Claire's newfound interest in going to the gym, or the way she often tilted her phone screen away when he walked into the room, were harmless quirks. After all, they'd been married for 15 years, long enough for any couple to fall into habits that sometimes felt like distance. Claire's occasional late nights for her freelance marketing job were just that, or so he told himself. It wasn't until one Tuesday evening, a little after 6, that those cracks began to widen. David had come home early, carrying bags of takeout from Claire's favorite Thai restaurant. It had been a small act of spontaneity, something he hadn't done in a while, and he was looking forward to surprising her. As he entered their quiet house, he expected to find Claire working at her laptop, or maybe scrolling through her phone in the living room. Instead, he found Ryan sitting on the couch, hunched over a video game controller, playing a game he knew was off-limits during school days. "Ryan," David said, setting the bags on the counter. "What's this?" Ryan didn't bother looking up. "Mom said it's fine," he replied casually, his tone indifferent. David frowned. "Where is she?" "Out," Ryan mumbled, still not looking away from the screen. "Out where?" Ryan shrugged, a flicker of something strange crossing his face. It wasn't outright guilt, but it was enough to make David pause. "She didn't say," Ryan added quickly before returning to his game. David wanted to push further, but he held back. He reminded himself that Claire often ran errands or had last-minute meetings with clients. But something about Ryan's detached tone lingered in his mind. He unpacked the food, setting it on the kitchen counter, and tried to shake the unease. When Claire returned later that evening, her disheveled hair and faintly smeared lipstick caught his attention immediately. "Meeting ran late," she said as she kicked off her shoes, her tone breezy and casual. Then, as if to change the subject, she grabbed one of the takeout boxes. "Oh, Ty! You didn't have to, babe." David wanted to ask more, to press her on where she'd been and why she hadn't mentioned the meeting earlier. But he didn't. Instead, he watched her eat, his appetite slowly disappearing as the unsettling feeling in his chest grew heavier. Over the following weeks, the subtle signs morphed into patterns. Claire's work emergencies started happening more often, always coinciding with evenings when David wasn't home. Her phone, once casually left on the coffee table or kitchen counter, was now glued to her side, the screen always dimming just as he approached. Even Ryan seemed to notice, his once chatty demeanor giving way to vague answers and a reluctance to make eye contact when David asked about his mother's day. But it wasn't until a Saturday morning that the betrayal began to take shape. David had planned a family breakfast, a rare treat given his busy work schedule. He'd woken early, making pancakes and setting the table. When he went to call Claire down, he found her in their bedroom, standing by the window with her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was soft, barely audible over the sound of birds chirping outside. "I miss you too," she said, her tone carrying a warmth David hadn't heard in months. His chest tightened. He froze in the doorway, listening as she laughed softly, a laugh that felt far too intimate. "Yes, I'll figure something out," she added, her back to him. David didn't confront her, not then. Instead, he returned to the kitchen, his mind racing. He told himself it could have been an old friend or even a client. But deep down, he knew better. The laughter, the softness in her voice, those weren't for him. That night, as Claire slept beside him, David stared at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over. His chest ached with questions he didn't want to answer. Was she seeing someone else? Was their marriage a lie? And worst of all, had Ryan noticed too? The answers began unraveling themselves soon enough. One evening, David had come home to find Ryan sprawled on the couch again. This time, he wasn't playing a game. Instead, he was scrolling through videos on his tablet. David sat beside him, trying to engage him in small talk. "Hey, buddy," he began. "How was school?" Ryan shrugged. "Fine. Just fine? Did anything cool happen?" "Nope." David sighed, frustrated by the wall Ryan had seemingly built around himself. Then, as if sensing his father's unease, Ryan said something that made David's heart stop. "Mom says you're too boring to get mad about stuff," he said matter-of-factly, his eyes still glued to the screen. "What did you say?" David asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Ryan glanced at him, his face blank. "Nothing," he muttered before returning to his video. David's mind spiraled. It wasn't just Claire's behavior, it was Ryan's too. His own son, the boy he'd read bedtime stories to, coached through his first soccer game, and cheered for at every school recital, was now slipping away from him. The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon. Claire had gone out shopping, leaving David and Ryan to their own devices. While tidying up, David noticed Claire's laptop sitting open on the dining table. He hesitated for only a moment before sitting down. The emails were there, plain as day. A string of exchanges between Claire and a man named Eric. Their tone was casual, but the undertones were unmistakable. Jokes about David's obliviousness, plans to meet in hotels, messages about how much they missed each other. David's stomach churned. The betrayal wasn't just a fear anymore, it was reality. And yet, what hurt even more than the words on the screen was the realization that Ryan must have known. His withdrawn behavior, his offhand comment about David being boring, they all pointed to one thing: Ryan wasn't just hiding something. He was on Claire's side. David closed the laptop, his hands trembling. His entire world had shifted, leaving him standing on unstable ground. Claire was cheating. Ryan was complicit. And David was left to piece together what little remained of the life he thought he had. But he wouldn't crumble. Not yet. David woke up the next morning with a gnawing emptiness in his chest, the kind that doesn't go away no matter how hard you try to push it down. He had barely slept, the images of Claire's emails looping endlessly in his mind. He couldn't stop imagining her with Eric, laughing, sharing inside jokes, exchanging stolen kisses. Each thought felt like a blade cutting deeper into his psyche. He didn't confront her that morning. He couldn't. Confrontation required clarity, and right now, David was lost in a sea of confusion and hurt. Claire moved about the kitchen with the same ease she always did, making breakfast while scrolling through her phone. She greeted him with a casual "morning," as if nothing had changed. But for David, everything had. Ryan, too, seemed oblivious. He munched on his cereal, his eyes darting between his father and mother, as though sensing the tension but saying nothing. The boy's usual chatter was absent, and David couldn't tell if it was guilt, fear, or just apathy. By the time David got to work, he felt like a shadow of himself. Sitting at his desk, he stared blankly at the spreadsheets in front of him, his mind still racing. The betrayal wasn't just about Claire's infidelity. It was the depth of the deception, the fact that his own son seemed to be in on it. Ryan, his pride and joy, had chosen Claire's side. But why? That question gnawed at him all day. Had he failed as a father? Had he been too focused on work, too predictable, too boring? Claire's comment about him being boring was bad enough, but hearing it parroted by Ryan had hit differently. It wasn't just an insult. It was confirmation of his worst fears, that he wasn't enough for his own family. During lunch, David sat alone in the office break room, poking at a sandwich he had no appetite for. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Claire. "Hey, don't forget, I've got a late meeting tonight. Can you pick up Ryan from practice? Thanks." He stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. The ease with which she lied, the casualness of it, It infuriated him. He didn't reply. Instead, he stuffed his phone into his pocket and resolved to find out the truth. That evening, after picking up Ryan from soccer practice, David decided to press his son for answers. They were halfway through dinner, sitting at the table in an uneasy silence, when David cleared his throat. "Ryan," he began carefully, "can I ask you something?" Ryan shrugged, stabbing at his macaroni with a fork. "Sure." David hesitated, unsure of how much to say. He didn't want to accuse his son outright, but he needed to understand. "You've been pretty quiet lately. Is everything okay? At school? At home?" Ryan didn't look up. "Everything's fine." "You sure? You can tell me if something's bothering you." David's voice was gentle, but there was a tremor of desperation he couldn't hide. Ryan finally met his eyes, his expression guarded. "I said it's fine, Dad." David sighed, leaning back in his chair. He could feel the wall between them, thicker than ever. Ryan wasn't going to open up, not yet at least. David decided to try another angle. "What do you think about Mom's friend, Eric?" he asked, his tone casual but deliberate. Ryan froze. It was subtle, just a flicker of hesitation, but David saw it. His son recovered quickly, shrugging as if the name meant nothing to him. "He's nice, I guess." David's chest tightened. "Nice how?" "I don't know," Ryan mumbled, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "He just talks to Mom a lot. He's funny." "Funny?" David repeated, his voice sharper than he intended. Ryan flinched, and David immediately regretted it. "Sorry, buddy. I didn't mean to sound angry. I'm just trying to understand." Ryan's gaze dropped to his plate. "I think Mom likes him," he said quietly, almost as if he were afraid of saying it out loud. David swallowed hard, his appetite long gone. "Does she ever talk about him to you?" Ryan shook his head. "Not really. But she smiles a lot when she's texting him." The words hit David like a sledgehammer. He forced himself to nod, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Thanks for telling me, Ryan. You can always talk to me, okay?" Ryan nodded, but he still wouldn't meet his father's eyes. David couldn't tell if it was shame or loyalty to Claire that kept the boy so guarded. Either way, it hurt. That night, after Ryan had gone to bed, David sat alone in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. The house was too quiet, save for the occasional sound of Claire moving around upstairs. She had come home late, as promised, carrying the scent of perfume and wine. She kissed him on the cheek, muttered something about a long meeting, and gone straight to the shower. David stared at the empty glass in his hand, his thoughts dark and spiraling. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they painted was one he didn't want to see. Claire was cheating. That much was clear now. But what was less clear, and far more painful, was Ryan's role in it all. The boy wasn't just an innocent bystander. He was part of the deception, however unwittingly. David didn't sleep that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the weight of his reality pressed down on him. When morning came, he knew he couldn't keep going like this. He needed proof, something undeniable, something that would strip Claire of her lies and force her to confront the truth. The next day, during his lunch break, David drove to a small electronics store on the outskirts of town. He bought a GPS tracker and a tiny recording device, both discreet enough to go unnoticed. He hated the idea of spying on his wife, but he hated the lies even more. That evening, while Claire was upstairs, David slipped the GPS tracker into her car. His hands were steady, his movements precise. He didn't feel guilt, only a cold, determined resolve. Later, as Claire prepared for another work meeting, David acted as if everything was normal. He kissed her goodbye, waved her off, and then immediately logged into the tracking app on his phone. The little blue dot moved across the map, taking her not to an office building, but to a swanky hotel downtown. David stared at the screen, his heart pounding. This was it, confirmation of everything he feared. Claire was cheating, and now he had proof. But as he watched the dots settle in the hotel parking lot, his anger gave way to something darker. He wasn't just going to confront her. He was going to make her pay. David sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he stared at the tracking app on his phone. The blue dot representing Claire's car hadn't moved for over an hour. It was parked in the lot of the Powood Hotel, a high-end establishment downtown known for its discreet clientele. The confirmation twisted something inside him, a mix of rage, betrayal, and an odd sense of validation. He hadn't wanted to be right, but now that he was, there was no turning back. He couldn't sit idly by while Claire betrayed him and dismantled the life they built together. David considered storming into the hotel, catching Claire in the act. But as much as he wanted to confront her, he knew it wasn't the right move. He needed to be methodical, to gather enough evidence to ensure there would be no room for denial or excuses. He couldn't let her gaslight him out of the truth. That's when an idea struck him. He picked up his phone and searched for private investigators in the area. Within minutes, he was on a call with a woman named Monica Ellis, who specialized in infidelity cases. Her calm, professional demeanor put him at ease as he explained his situation. "Do you have any evidence so far?" Monica asked. "I have enough to know she's meeting someone at the Powood Hotel right now," David replied, his voice tight with frustration. "But I need more. Something undeniable." "Understood," Monica said. "Send me the details, and I'll take it from here. We'll document everything." It felt strange, handing over the reins to a stranger. But David knew he couldn't do this alone. Monica assured him she'd have a report, and if necessary, photographic evidence, within a week. As he ended the call, a grim sense of determination settled over him. The wheels were in motion, and Claire had no idea. The week that followed was one of the longest of David's life. At home, he played the role of the oblivious husband, masking his growing anger with forced smiles and casual small talk. Claire continued her usual routine, disappearing for meetings, several evenings that week. Each time, David tracked her movements through the app, confirming that she returned to the same hotel. Ryan's behavior didn't help. The boy's loyalty to Claire was clear, and every interaction between father and son felt strained. David tried to bridge the gap, offering to help with homework or suggesting a trip to the park, but Ryan shrugged him off with indifference. On Friday evening, Monica called. "I have what you need," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of empathy. "We need to meet." David parked outside Monica's modest office building, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what he'd feel when faced with the evidence, but he knew he had to see it for himself. Monica greeted him in a small, private office, sliding a manila folder across the desk. "I've documented everything," she said. "Dates, times, locations. There's also photographic evidence. It's thorough." David opened the folder, his breath catching as he scanned the contents. The photos were devastating. Claire and a tall, well-dressed man, Eric, he presumed, laughing over wine, holding hands, and embracing as they entered the hotel. One photo showed them kissing in the lobby, oblivious to the world around them. But what hit hardest wasn't the images. It was the text messages Monica had intercepted. Claire's words to Eric were affectionate, playful, and laced with a contempt for David that made his stomach churn. "He's so predictable. I feel like I'm living with a robot. You make me feel alive in a way he never could." Each message was a dagger, twisting deeper into the wounds Claire had already inflicted. "Are you okay?" Monica asked, her voice breaking through David's haze. He nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah. I just needed to see it." Monica hesitated. "There's more." She handed him a second envelope. Inside were receipts, transactions from a joint account David hadn't checked in months. Claire had been withdrawing money in large amounts, likely to fund her outings with Eric. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial. David clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He felt humiliated, angry, and most of all, determined. "Thank you, Monica," he said. "This is everything I need." That night, David sat alone in the living room, staring at the folder. He wanted to confront Claire, to lay everything bare and watch her squirm under the weight of her lies. But he held back. This wasn't the time for emotion. It was time for action. Claire didn't know it yet, but David was done being the predictable, passive husband she thought she could manipulate. She'd underestimated him, and that was her first mistake. The first step in David's plan was reclaiming control. He began with their finances, meticulously combing through their accounts and freezing any that Claire could access. He set up a new account in his name, transferring his savings and securing his income. By the end of the weekend, he'd effectively cut Claire off without her knowledge. Next, David began focusing on himself. He signed up for a gym membership, a decision driven by both anger and the realization that he'd let himself become complacent over the years. The first workout was brutal, leaving him sore and exhausted, but it felt good. For the first time in months, he felt like he was taking control of his own narrative. At work, David threw himself into projects with a renewed vigor. He volunteered for new responsibilities and networked with colleagues he'd previously ignored. His dedication didn't go unnoticed. Within a few weeks, his manager hinted at a potential promotion. Meanwhile, Claire continued her charade, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. She still smiled at David in the mornings, kissed him on the cheek before her meetings, and texted him sweet nothings during the day. But David no longer felt pain when she did these things. Instead, he felt cold satisfaction. Her lies had lost their power. Ryan remained distant, though David didn't blame him. The boy was caught in a web of deception he didn't fully understand. But David wasn't ready to give up on their relationship. He began finding small ways to connect, helping with science projects, showing up to his soccer games, and listening intently when Ryan chose to speak. One evening, as they sat together watching TV, Ryan glanced at his father and said, "You've been different lately." David smiled. "Different how?" "I don't know," Ryan said, frowning slightly. "You just seem stronger." David's chest tightened, but he kept his tone light. "Maybe I am." By the end of the month, David was ready for the next phase of his plan. He'd spent weeks gathering evidence, securing his finances, and rebuilding himself. Now, it was time to confront Claire, not with anger, but with cold, calculated precision. This wasn't about saving their marriage anymore. It was about reclaiming his life. The house was quiet when David came home that evening, a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling in his chest. His plans were set, and every piece was in place. He'd spent weeks gathering evidence, rebuilding his confidence, and securing his position. Tonight, it was time to confront Claire. He walked into the kitchen, where Claire stood at the counter pouring herself a glass of wine. She glanced up, offering him a casual smile. "Hey, you're home early. Dinner's in the oven." David didn't respond. Instead, he placed his briefcase on the counter and pulled out the manila folder containing Monica's report. The weight of it felt heavier than it should, but David's resolve was unwavering. Claire's smile faltered as she noticed the seriousness in his expression. "What's that?" she asked, her tone light but edged with unease. David slid the folder across the counter toward her. "Why don't you take a look?" Claire hesitated, her hand hovering over the folder. "What is this, David?" "It's the truth," he replied, his voice calm but cold. "Open it." She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents inside. The color drained from her face as she flipped through the photographs, text messages, and receipts. David watched her carefully, noting every flicker of emotion, shock, guilt, and finally defiance. "This isn't what it looks like," Claire said, her voice trembling slightly. She closed the folder and pushed it away, as though denying its existence would make it disappear. "Don't insult me," David said sharply. "I know everything, Claire. I know about Eric, about the meetings at the Pullwood Hotel, and about the money you've been siphoning from our accounts. You've been lying to me for months, and I have the proof." Claire's mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked down, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It just happened. David laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and unrecognizable even to himself. It just happened? That's the best you've got. You've been planning this for months, Claire. Don't act like this was some spur-of-the-moment mistake. Claire straightened, her expression hardening. You think this is all my fault? Have you ever thought about why I turned to Eric in the first place? You've been so checked out of this marriage, David. You're boring. Predictable. You spend more time at work or with your spreadsheets than you do with me. I needed more. More? David repeated, his voice rising. So you decided to destroy our family for more? What about Ryan? What about the life we built together? Does any of that matter to you? Don't bring Ryan into this, Claire snapped. He doesn't need to be involved. David's eyes narrowed. He's already involved. Don't think for a second that I haven't noticed how you've turned him against me. The way he looks at me, the things he says, it's clear you've been feeding him your version of the story. Claire crossed her arms, her gaze defiant. Ryan's smart enough to see things for himself. Maybe if he'd been more present, he wouldn't feel the way he does. The words cut deeper than David wanted to admit, but he refused to let Claire see it. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice low and steady. You've underestimated me, Claire. You thought you could lie, cheat, and manipulate your way out of this without consequences. But I'm not the man you think I am anymore. I've taken control of our finances. I've spoken to a lawyer. And I'm filing for divorce. Claire's eyes widened in shock. You're filing for divorce? You're not even going to try to work this out? Work this out? David's laugh was hollow. There's nothing to work out, Claire. You made your choice when you started sneaking around with Eric. You've shown me exactly who you are, and I believe you. Claire's confidence wavered, and for a moment, David saw the woman he'd fallen in love with, the woman he'd built a life with. But that moment passed as quickly as it had come, replaced by the hardened exterior of a woman who had chosen her path. Fine, Claire said, her voice cold. If that's what you want, go ahead. But don't think for a second that I'm going to roll over and let you take everything. David shook his head, a grim smile on his lips. You've already taken everything, Claire. Now it's my turn to take it back. The days following the confrontation were tense and emotionally draining. Claire refused to move out, claiming she needed time to figure out her next steps. David didn't argue. He knew he had the upper hand. His lawyer assured him that the evidence Monica had gathered would hold up in court, and David's decision to secure their finances had given him an advantage. At work, David threw himself into his projects, using his anger and frustration as fuel. His colleagues noticed the change, commenting on his newfound confidence and focus. Even his manager pulled him aside to discuss a potential promotion. Meanwhile, David's relationship with Ryan remained strained. The boy seemed torn between his parents, unsure of where his loyalty should lie. David did his best to be patient, offering small gestures of support and reassurance. He hoped that, in time, Ryan would see the truth. One evening, as David was helping Ryan with a school project, the boy finally spoke up. Are you and Mom really getting a divorce? David paused, looking at his son's worried face. Yes, we are, he said gently. But it's not your fault, Ryan. None of this is your fault. Ryan hesitated. Did you do something to make Mom mad? David's heart sank. He realized how deeply Claire's manipulation had affected their son. No, buddy. Your mom and I just grew apart. But I'm still your dad, and I'll always be here for you. That's never going to change. Ryan nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Okay. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the divorce proceedings began, David felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He was no longer the passive husband Claire had dismissed as boring. He was in control of his life, and he wasn't going to let her, or anyone else, dictate his future. The confrontation had been painful, but it had also been liberating. For the first time in a long time, David felt free. The house had become a battlefield, its walls barely containing the tension that seemed to thrum constantly. David and Claire communicated only when necessary, their conversations clipped and emotionless. Ryan, caught in the middle, moved through the house like a ghost, his usual liveliness dimmed by the weight of the situation. David's resolve, however, grew stronger with each passing day. He'd spent years being the predictable, passive husband, the man who provided stability but little else. Now, he was determined to shed that version of himself entirely. Claire's betrayal had ignited something within him, a need not just to survive but to thrive, to show her, and himself, that he was capable of far more than she'd ever given him credit for. David's transformation began in earnest. He started each day at the gym, pouring his anger and frustration into the iron weights. At first, it was grueling. His body ached from the effort, and there were moments when he wanted to quit, but he pushed through. He envisioned every rep as a step further away from the weak, complacent man Claire had dismissed. Within weeks, the changes became noticeable. His clothes fit better, his posture straightened, and his confidence grew. Colleagues at work commented on his energy, noting how he seemed sharper, more decisive. His manager approached him again, this time with a concrete offer, a promotion to senior accountant. It came with a significant pay raise and the promise of more influence within the firm. David accepted without hesitation. "Congratulations," his manager said, shaking his hand. "You've earned this." The promotion was more than just a professional milestone, it was a personal victory. Claire had accused him of being boring and predictable, of lacking ambition. But now, as his career flourished, David knew he was proving her wrong in every way that mattered. Meanwhile, Claire's demeanor shifted as the divorce proceedings began in earnest. The confident, defiant woman who had dismissed David during their confrontation started showing cracks in her armor. The financial strain of losing access to their shared accounts began to weigh on her, and the reality of their split seemed to settle in. One evening, as David was finishing up dinner with Ryan, Claire approached him in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "Do we have to do this?" she asked, her voice softer than he'd heard in weeks. "Do we really have to end things like this?" David set his fork down, studying her carefully. "What's this about Claire?" "I'm just saying," she continued, avoiding his gaze. "We've been together for 15 years. We have a family. Maybe we could try again." David's jaw tightened. He prepared himself for many things, anger, defiance, even tears, but not this. He wasn't sure if her words were genuine or if they were born out of desperation. Either way, he wasn't interested. "Claire," he said, his tone firm, "this isn't something I decided on a whim. You made your choices, and I've made mine. There's no going back." Her expression hardened, the vulnerability disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. "Fine," she snapped. "But don't think for a second that you're coming out of this unscathed. I'll fight you for everything." David nodded, unfazed. "Do what you need to do, Claire. But I've already spoken to my lawyer, and I have the evidence. You won't win this." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't reply. Instead, she turned and stormed out of the kitchen, leaving David alone with his thoughts. The weeks that followed were grueling. Claire's threats proved to be more than empty words. She hired an aggressive lawyer, one who dug into every aspect of David's life, searching for leverage. She attempted to paint him as an inattentive husband, claiming that his long hours at work had driven her into Eric's arms. David, however, was prepared. His lawyer countered every argument with the evidence Monica had gathered, photos, messages, and financial records that painted a clear picture of Claire's betrayal. The court proceedings were draining, but with each hearing, David felt more in control. Outside the courtroom, David continued to focus on himself. His new role at work demanded more of his time and energy, but he welcomed the challenge. He also made an effort to connect with Ryan, though their relationship remained strained. One afternoon, David picked Ryan up from soccer practice. As they drove home, the boy was unusually quiet. David glanced at him, sensing that something was on his mind. "Everything okay, buddy?" he asked. Ryan hesitated, then sighed. I don't know. David pulled the car into the driveway and turned off the engine, giving Ryan his full attention. Talk to me, he said gently. What's going on? Ryan stared at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know who to believe anymore. David's heart ached at the boy's words. You don't have to pick sides, Ryan, he said. Your mom and I both love you, no matter what. Ryan looked up, his eyes filled with confusion. But you and Mom hate each other now. David shook his head. I don't hate your mom, he said honestly. I'm angry about the choices she made, but that doesn't mean I hate her. And no matter what happens between us, you're still our son. That will never change. Ryan nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. As the divorce proceedings neared their conclusion, David began to see the light at the end of the tunnel. His lawyer had negotiated a favorable settlement, ensuring that David would retain the majority of their assets and primary custody of Ryan. Claire, defeated but defiant, agreed to the terms, though it was clear the loss stung. David's final victory came when Monica presented him with one last piece of evidence. Proof that Claire and Eric's relationship had ended shortly after the confrontation. It seemed Eric hadn't been interested in the long-term complications of Claire's life, leaving her to face the fallout alone. David couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction. She'd gambled everything and lost. On the day the divorce was finalized, David stood outside the courthouse, the weight of the past few months finally lifting. He wasn't the same man who had walked into this mess. He'd been broken, yes, but he'd rebuilt himself stronger than before. As he drove home, he glanced at Ryan in the rearview mirror. The boy was quiet, gazing out the window, but there was a calmness in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. Pizza for dinner? David asked, a small smile playing on his lips. Ryan turned to him, nodding. Yeah. Extra pepperoni. David laughed softly, his heart swelling with hope. The storm had passed, and now, finally, they could begin to rebuild. The months following the divorce were a whirlwind of change for David. The finality of the separation was both liberating and sobering. There were nights when the silence of the house felt oppressive, the absence of Claire's presence a reminder of what had been lost. But more often, the quiet felt like a reprieve, a chance to rebuild himself without the shadow of betrayal looming over him. David threw himself into his work and personal development with a relentless determination. His promotion at the accounting firm had elevated his career to new heights, and he made it a point to exceed expectations. Long hours were no longer a chore but a testament to his resilience. The office buzzed with talk of his transformation, and colleagues who once overlooked him now sought his input and advice. But it wasn't just his career that was flourishing. David had become a regular at the gym, his early struggles with fitness giving way to a newfound confidence. His body had begun to reflect the inner strength he was cultivating, leaner, stronger, and more capable. The trainers took notice, offering encouragement and advice, and David found himself thriving in the camaraderie of shared goals. One Saturday morning, David stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of a crisp white shirt. He had an event to attend, a networking gala hosted by his firm. A few months ago, he would have dreaded such an event, blending into the background as he always had. But tonight he felt different. He wasn't just attending as David Turner, the accountant. He was showing up as a man who had survived, rebuilt, and risen above. As he smoothed down his shirt, Ryan appeared in the doorway. The boy's eyes flicked over his father's appearance, a flicker of admiration crossing his face. "You look good, Dad," he said. David turned, smiling. "Thanks, buddy. What about you? Big plans for the weekend?" Ryan shrugged, his tone casual but warm. "Just hanging out with friends." David nodded, sensing that Ryan was slowly beginning to warm up to him again. Their relationship had been strained in the wake of the divorce, but the cracks were starting to heal. They'd spent more time together lately, soccer games, movie nights, and even quiet evenings just talking. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The gala was held in an opulent downtown venue, its marble floors gleaming under the glow of crystal chandeliers. David arrived feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He hadn't attended many social events since the divorce, and part of him still wondered how others perceived him. But as he walked through the crowd, exchanging handshakes and polite conversation, he realized something important. He no longer cared about the whispers or judgments. He was there for himself. The night passed in a blur of introductions and networking, and for the first time in years, David felt fully present. He met people from different industries, swapped ideas, and even caught the attention of a venture capitalist interested in funding an accounting startup. The man handed David his cards, saying, "You've got potential, David. Let's talk." By the time the event wound down, David felt invigorated. He had stepped out of his comfort zone and thrived, proving to himself that he was capable of more than he'd ever believed. Back at home, Ryan was waiting for him in the living room, a bowl of popcorn on his lap and a movie paused on the screen. "How was it?" he asked, looking genuinely curious. "Pretty good," David replied, loosening his tie. "Met some interesting people. What about you? How was your night?" Ryan grinned. "I beat Liam at Call of Duty, so that was cool." David chuckled, sinking into the couch beside his son. "Sounds like a good night." For the first time in what felt like forever, the house felt like home again. They sat together, watching the rest of the movie, the distance between them narrowing with each shared laugh and comment. The next few weeks brought even more changes. David had begun working on a side project, an idea for a financial consulting firm he'd been toying with for years. The venture capitalist from the gala had followed up, expressing genuine interest in backing the endeavor. Though it was still in its infancy, the project gave David a sense of purpose beyond his day job. At the gym, he began pushing himself harder, finding strength in the physical challenges he once dreaded. His trainers encouraged him to try new things: boxing, climbing, even running a marathon. David, to his own surprise, agreed to sign up for a local 10K run. It wasn't about winning, it was about proving to himself how far he'd come. But not everything was smooth sailing. Claire's presence still lingered in their lives, particularly when it came to Ryan. She had visitation rights, and though she tried to maintain a good relationship with their son, Ryan's demeanor when he returned from her house was often subdued. One evening, after dropping Ryan off at Claire's, David decided to take a detour on his way home. He found himself at a quiet overlook on the outskirts of town, a place he used to visit during college when life felt overwhelming. Sitting on the hood of his car, he stared out at the city lights below, thinking about everything he'd been through. He thought about Claire's betrayal, about the pain of discovering her lies and the anger that had fueled his transformation. He thought about Ryan, the boy who had been caught in the middle and was slowly finding his way back to him. And he thought about himself, the man he was becoming. For the first time in months, David allowed himself to feel proud. Proud of the work he'd done, the strength he'd found, and the future he was building. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. One Saturday, David and Ryan stood together at the starting line of the 10K run. Ryan had insisted on joining him, excited to take part in something his father had trained so hard for. As the starting gun fired, they took off together, their strides falling into rhythm. The run was grueling but exhilarating. David felt the burn in his legs, the pounding of his heart, and the rush of adrenaline as they neared the finish line. Ryan, too, was pushing himself, his face set with determination. When they crossed the finish line together, David felt a swell of pride unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He looked at his son, whose grin was wide despite his exhaustion. "We did it," Ryan said, his voice breathless but triumphant. "Yeah, we did," David replied, clapping a hand on Ryan's shoulder. In that moment, David realized that the journey wasn't just about proving Claire wrong or rebuilding his life. It was about building a future for himself and Ryan. One step at a time, they were moving forward together. The months after the 10K run marked a turning point for David. His transformation wasn't just physical or professional anymore, it was emotional, even spiritual. He had reclaimed his sense of self, and with every step forward, he felt more in control of his life. The shadow of Claire's betrayal, while still present, no longer loomed as large. It was just a memory, a lesson that had made him stronger. But there was one thing David hadn't fully addressed yet: Ryan's lingering loyalty to Claire. The boy was caught in a difficult position, and David knew it would take time for him to sort through his feelings. Still, David was determined to rebuild their bond, no matter how long it took. One afternoon, as they sat together at a diner after Ryan's soccer practice, David decided it was time to have a real conversation. They had fallen into a routine of talking about surface-level topics: school, soccer, video games, but David wanted more. "Hey, Ryan," he said, setting his coffee cup down. "Can I ask you something?" Ryan looked up from his burger, chewing thoughtfully. "Yeah?" David hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "How are you feeling about everything? About me and your mom? About the divorce?" Ryan frowned, pushing a fry around his plate. "I don't know," he said finally. "It's weird." "Weird how?" Ryan shrugged, avoiding his father's gaze. "Just different. I mean, I like being here with you, but sometimes I feel like I'm supposed to like being at Mom's more. She always talks about how she's trying her best, and she says you're the one who gave up." David felt a familiar pang of anger at Claire's manipulation, but he forced himself to stay calm. "And what do you think?" he asked gently. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he said again. "Sometimes I get mad at you. But then I think about how you've been here, and I don't know why I feel that way." David leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "It's okay to feel confused, Ryan. It's okay to feel mad, even. I just want you to know that I've always been here for you, and I always will be. No matter what your mom says, you're the most important thing in my life." Ryan's eyes flicked up to meet his father's. "Really? Really?" David said firmly. "And I know this has been hard for you. It's been hard for me too. But we're going to get through it. Together." Ryan nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his expression. "Thanks, Dad." David smiled, feeling a small but significant weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't a full resolution, but it was a step forward, a moment of honesty that brought them closer together. As the weeks passed, David continued to focus on his goals. His side project, the financial consulting firm, was gaining traction, thanks to the support of the venture capitalist he'd met at the gala. He spent late nights drafting business plans, researching competitors, and refining his pitch. The hard work paid off when his backer agreed to fund the initial launch. The news came on a Friday afternoon, just as David was wrapping up at his day job. His phone buzzed with an email confirmation, and he couldn't help but smile as he read the words. It was official. He was starting his own business. A part of him couldn't believe it. Just months ago, he had been struggling to hold his life together, and now he was building something entirely his own. When he told Ryan that evening, the boy's reaction surprised him. "That's awesome, Dad," Ryan said, his face lighting up. "Does that mean you're like a boss now?" "Something like that," David replied with a laugh. "It's going to be a lot of work, but I think it's worth it." Ryan nodded enthusiastically. "Can I help?" David blinked, taken aback by the offer. "You want to help?" "Yeah. I mean, I don't know what I can do, but maybe I could help you organize stuff or something." David felt a swell of pride. "I'd like that, buddy. Let's make it a family project." Meanwhile, Claire's life seemed to be unraveling. David heard snippets from mutual acquaintances: how Eric had left her shortly after their affair was exposed, how she was struggling to keep up with bills after losing access to their joint accounts. She had even taken on extra freelance work to make ends meet, something she hadn't done in years. David didn't take pleasure in her misfortune, but he couldn't deny a sense of vindication. She had gambled everything, and she'd lost. Now, she was facing the consequences of her actions. Claire, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. During one of Ryan's visits, she told the boy that she wanted to start over with David. When Ryan relayed the conversation to his father, David couldn't help but shake his head. She said she wants to get back together, Ryan said, watching his father's reaction carefully. Do you think you will? No, buddy, David said firmly. We're not getting back together. What your mom and I had is over, and it's better this way. Why? Ryan asked, his brow furrowing. Because some things can't be fixed, David said, choosing his words carefully. And that's okay. Sometimes the best thing we can do is move forward. Ryan nodded, though he still looked thoughtful. David hoped his son would come to understand in time. As David's consulting firm began to take off, he found himself thriving in ways he hadn't imagined. The challenges were daunting, but they were also exhilarating. He was no longer just rebuilding his life, he was creating something entirely new. One evening, as he sat in his home office finalizing a proposal, Ryan appeared in the doorway with a notebook in hand. What are you working on? The boy asked, his curiosity evident. A pitch for a new client, David replied. What about you? What's with the notebook? Ryan grinned, holding it up. I made a logo for your company. Want to see? David's heart swelled as Ryan flipped open the notebook, revealing a series of sketches. The designs were simple but creative, and David couldn't help but smile. These are great, Ryan, he said. Thanks for doing this. Ryan beamed. You're welcome. I just thought it would be cool to help. David reached out, ruffling his son's hair. It's more than cool. It's perfect. In that moment, David realized how far they'd come. The journey wasn't over, but they were moving forward together. And for the first time in a long time, David felt like the future was bright. The morning sun streamed through the windows of David's new office, casting golden light across the sleek furniture and modern decor. He stood by the window, sipping his coffee and gazing out at the bustling city below. It was a far cry from the quiet suburban neighborhood he had once called home, but this new chapter felt right. This space, his office, was a tangible reminder of how far he'd come. The financial consulting firm he had poured his energy into was now fully operational. His venture capitalist partner had come through on funding, and David had spent months assembling a small but capable team. They just signed their first major client the previous week, a milestone that marked not only the company's success but also David's personal triumph. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. At home, life with Ryan had settled into a steady rhythm. Their bond had strengthened in ways David hadn't thought possible just months ago. Gone were the guarded conversations and lingering doubts. In their place was a sense of mutual respect and trust that had been hard-won through effort and understanding. One evening, as David and Ryan sat together on the couch flipping through channels, Ryan turned to him with a question that caught him off guard. Do you think Mom's happy? The boy asked, his tone curious but not accusatory. David hesitated, setting the remote down. Why do you ask? Ryan shrugged, fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. I don't know. She just seems different. Like not as happy as she used to be. David considered his words carefully. Sometimes people make choices they think will make them happy, but those choices don't always work out the way they hoped. Ryan nodded slowly, processing the response. Do you think she regrets what happened? David leaned back, sighing. Maybe. But what matters now is that we focus on the future. On what we're building together. Ryan smiled, a small but genuine expression that warmed David's heart. I like what we're building, the boy said simply. Despite the progress David and Ryan had made, Claire still lingered in their lives. She continued to press Ryan with questions during her visitation weekends, trying to sow doubt about David's decisions. But her efforts seemed increasingly futile. Ryan, having seen his father's transformation firsthand, had begun to see through Claire's attempts at manipulation. One Saturday, after returning from a weekend at her house, Ryan told David about a particularly tense conversation. She said you'd moved on too fast, Ryan said, watching David's reaction carefully. David raised an eyebrow, setting down the book he'd been reading. And what do you think? Ryan shrugged. I think she's wrong. You're just better now. David smiled, feeling a swell of pride. Thanks, buddy. That means a lot. Ryan hesitated before continuing. I think she's jealous. David's smile faltered. Jealous of what? Of how you've changed, Ryan said simply. She talks about it like it's a bad thing, but I think she wishes she could change too. The observation caught David off guard, but it wasn't entirely surprising. Claire's life had stagnated after the divorce. While David had rebuilt himself, she had remained stuck in the aftermath of her own choices. It wasn't something David took pleasure in, but he couldn't deny the truth of Ryan's words. As the months rolled on, David's professional and personal lives continued to flourish. The consulting firm signed more clients, and David began to attract attention from industry leaders. Invitations to speak at conferences and networking events poured in, and he found himself in demand in ways he'd never imagined. One such event took place on a crisp autumn evening. David stood before a crowd of business professionals, sharing his insights on navigating financial challenges. As he spoke, he noticed a woman in the audience watching him intently. After the event, she approached him, introducing herself as Emma, a corporate attorney who specialized in startups. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, and David found himself drawn to her intelligence and warmth. For the first time since the divorce, he felt a spark of something new, a possibility he hadn't considered in a long time. Emma gave him her card before leaving, her smile lingering in his mind long after she was gone. David didn't know where it would lead, but he felt ready to find out. Back at home, Ryan was thriving in his own way. He joined the school's robotics club and taken an interest in programming, often showing David the projects he was working on. David made a point to encourage his son's passions, proud of the boy's curiosity and determination. One evening, as they worked together on a particularly complex coding problem, Ryan looked up and said, "I'm glad things turned out the way they did." David paused, surprised. "What do you mean?" I miss how things used to be sometimes," Ryan admitted, "but I like how we are now. I like that you're happier." David smiled, reaching out to ruffle Ryan's hair. "Me too, buddy. Me too." The culmination of David's journey came one crisp winter morning, almost a year to the day after Claire's betrayal had come to light. Standing in his office, overlooking the city, David reflected on everything that had brought him to this moment. The pain, the anger, the hard work, it had all been worth it. He wasn't the same man he'd been a year ago. He was stronger, wiser, and more in tune with what mattered most. His phone buzzed on the desk, a message from Emma. "Dinner this week?" David smiled, typing back a quick response. "Absolutely." As he set the phone down, Ryan's voice called out from the doorway. "Dad, are you ready? We're going to be late." David turned to see his son, bundled up in a scarf and jacket, holding a pair of tickets. They were heading to a winter festival, something Ryan had insisted on attending together. David grabbed his coat, grinning as he joined his son. "Let's go," he said, clapping a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "Wouldn't want to miss the hot chocolate." As they stepped out into the crisp winter air, David felt a profound sense of peace. His life wasn't perfect, but it was his. And for the first time in years, he felt truly free.